Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Dan Nessel Show. I'm your host, Dan Nessel, and today I'm here with Kyle Hegarty, the Managing Director of TSL Marketing in Singapore and the author of the brand new sensational book, The Accidental Business Nomad. Kyle's been living and working abroad for over a decade, and he's learned, sometimes the hard way, the ups and downs of cross-cultural communication and leadership. Now he helps companies and leaders to embrace and understand how people work and communicate across cultures. Now, it doesn't really matter whether you've worked abroad or not, because the issues that Kyle contends with and that he talks about in the book are kind of universal to us, especially in today's day and age where so many of us are working remotely or working across cultures, even in our home countries. So I know you'll really enjoy this conversation as me and Kyle talk about his experiences, or both of our experiences abroad, and why these days we're all accidental business nomads. So let's get right into it. Kyle Hegarty, how are you? How you doing?
I'm good. I'm gonna be fisting my coffee all morning here. I've been my first call was actually last night. My calls ended at 11 p.m. and then I had stuff started at 5 a.m. this morning. So it's 8 a.m. here, but it feels like I'm kind of at the second half of my day. Like I don't even know what it feels like anymore. This is like
here being Singapore.
Here in Singapore, that's right. So what are we? 12 hours?
That's
difference?
your here. I think we're exactly the opposite. Your here is Singapore. My here is New Jersey, and I'm glad you just started out by talking about exactly that point, because being an international worker, being a global worker, a global minded thinker, a global thinker, depending however you want to call it, I think it just makes time go away. Like time just has a very odd sense.
Another way to think about it, and this is really relevant in 2020, is that this concept of like a 9-to-5 job, that's totally out the window. And I think a lot of people are wrestling with this now, and they haven't, because people, I'm seeing all the reports and studies saying that people are working more. Their hours are increasing because they're at home and they don't know when to shut off. This is a global workers problem. We've been going through this for decades. So I have this kind of cruel, what's the German word? Schadenfreude on the whole thing of like, finally, like the rest of the world is understanding what we have been struggling with for decades.
When you work globally, whether you're physically having to go to different locations, or your team is spread around the world, and you deal with a lot of the concepts and the people issues, let's say, that we will talk about during this conversation today. I absolutely 100% agree with you that the clock just doesn't have the same exact meaning. In fact, it's sort of maybe a frightening thing, because we have been working round the clock at odd hours and at different hours in bits and pieces for those of us, especially who've been remote,
I think about it as a threat and an opportunity, or not even a threat, but so it's definitely a different approach. But if you own it, if you kind of buy it and go into it, you can have a hell of a lifestyle. Years ago, this would have been like 12, 14 years ago, all of my stuff was US based. So I was on calls nighttime. I got my golf game, in order. I got to go golfing, and it was interesting because I would feel guilty for the first couple of months. I'll go out swimming, or I'll go out and exercise for a chunk of time in the middle of the day, feeling guilty. Mm-hmm. But you get over that. but it's a journey. Like, you got to kind of mentally break out of what we're used to.
It is, and it's that guilt that I always get a kick out of now. And that's where the Schadenfreude kicks in, because, like you said, now with this whole dawn of the remote worker, or the mainstreaming of the remote worker, I suppose, all these folks are saying, I have to be in front of my PC at 8 or 9 a.m. And what happens if I step away?
There's like a phase that most organizations go through when they go down this remote journey. We did it in 2000 with TSL. We did it in 2006. I mean, I personally did it, and then the whole company went virtual, I think, by 2008. Almost, so they got rid of a lot of their offices in the US. And we ended up having a team of about 300 people worldwide without really a main office. And what ends up happening in most companies, organizations, is that you start it, you get nervous as hell, you start monitoring people, you start looking at their daily behavior, then you start getting nervous, so you put rules in place. And the rules could be, you know what, you need to be able to respond from 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m., and then something goes wrong, and then there's, of course, technology that can help monitor people. And so then you start over-monitoring people and policing people. And then you realize that, man, actually, maybe we've missed the entire point. It's not about input, it's about output. So you have to switch your entire management style and even measurement style to think, we actually now need to be focused on what people are producing rather than what the hell they're doing on an hourly basis. Let's stop treating people like children, and let's actually focus on the output. And it's harder than it sounds to go through, but it's amazing how many companies are now rushing through this or trying to go through it.
I think it's incredibly hard. And I think now when you layer on this idea of, especially for those of us who are global people, when you layer on the cultural challenges that come across, not only in the workplace, but working remotely, when you have a Zoom call now with people in meeting rooms in Tokyo, Singapore, London, et cetera. If you're the lucky one who has that terrible time slot where you have that global call and you pick the short straw.
The Asian guys usually get the short end of that stick, typically. Just the way it works, right?
Yeah. But the book that you've just written, and forgive me, listeners, because we just jumped into it, but I didn't get a chance to really say that I'm sitting here speaking with Kyle Hegarty. And the reason I'm talking with Kyle is, of course, he was referred to me by Raymond McConnell, who was on one of my recent podcasts. And, Raymond, being a global trainer and a global businessman, entrepreneur, very deep in the knowledge. As soon as he recommended that I speak with Kyle, I knew that I was going to be onto something really great. Of course, I get on the phone with Kyle, and just to meet. And it turns out, okay, he's written this incredible book called The Accidental Business Nomad. And for those of us who have spent any time outside of their home country, particularly in Asia, but it doesn't have to be, for anybody who's spent time working abroad and dealt with more than one cultural type or more than one culture at any given time, right? This book is an absolute must. I mean, you've read probably, or you've been through these culture shock trainings, or you have talked about, culture shock as you go through your own professional career. And maybe you've read articles, and maybe you've been through the DISC trainings, and maybe you've been through all these different things. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of it's dry. It comes through your experience, and the longer you are abroad, the better you get at this stuff, generally speaking. But Kyle's book is a narrative style. It's told through stories, anecdotes. It's very personable, and delivers those same lessons that you need in a very relatable way. So that was my build up for you, Kyle.
I love it.
I meant to say that because. And one last thing before I turn this over to you, because I've been known to talk a little bit, but I found something, I got to say, a little Bill Bryson-esque about your book, right?
Take that as a massive compliment.
Well, he's one of my faves. But the reason is, not only are you a good writer, but it's because Bill seems to have, and forgive me, Bill, for calling you Bill, I don't know you, but Mr. Bryson seems to have this knack of going into a bar, and writing stuff down on matchbooks and napkins, and then generally speaking, getting pretty shit-faced. And then the next day, he's got a chapter of his new book.
He's got.
Now, I'm not sure about the shit-faced part, but without giving away too much, all of your Centurion Club meetings or getaways and the bar time discussions with Axel just brought me in mind of, okay, that's where the real action happens, is over a couple of beers.
So Yeah, no, and thank you for that. That was a great review. Always good to hear. And a long time ago, it was funny. People were saying, well, what would you aspire for? I said, I'd love to be accused of like copying either a Bill Bryson or a Michael Lewis. I'd love to be accused of
Yeah.
of that kind of genre, stealing, theft, and so bringing him up is appreciated. The book is called Accidental Business Nomad, and this was written before COVID, before this year. But the idea was that this is not just an expat problem anymore. People now who are working in teams, whether or not they're traveling, I think I mentioned it. It's like you could be a global worker but not have a passport, and that's totally normal now. The problem is that you've gone through it, I've gone through it. The expats, what we do, we run into something, and this is not just a Western thing, this is everybody thing, right? We go to another part of the world, we have these mega culture shocks, these weird situations that have these unintended consequences, and at the end of the week, we end up at a bar drinking away our sorrows going, what the hell just happened? And that's in fact how I met your friend Raymond.
Yeah.
And
That's how we
so,
meet anybody. That's how we meet most people.
exactly. And so, but the thing is that it's at those bar conversations where people they open up. They're oftentimes less guarded, so they're telling more realistic kind of stories. They're showing a little bit more vulnerability, and you can learn stuff there. It can be in delivered in like bits and pieces. And that's where I started the book. The book is very deliberately starts in a bar setting like that. And the idea, what I was trying to do was say, well, can I put a narrative together that almost puts all of this stuff into a bottle that can be enjoyed and easily digested by somebody to feel like they've kind of fast-tracked through some of these learnings, especially for people that aren't traveling that much, who have become accidentally global without necessarily meaning to. So the COVID lockdown, obviously it's not a good thing, but it plays directly into what I was seeing anyway, which is that more and more people are working in a virtual global environment, facing and wrestling these cultural issues.
Yeah, and understanding that you are a global worker, pretty much. I mean, most people will be or are, whether they know it or not, from your call center employee all the way up to
Yep.
your VP or CEO.
Your partners, your resellers, your part of your operation supply chain, right? I mean, there's all different areas of this. And what I focus on is more on the sales and marketing side. So oftentimes your customers. And quite frankly, where I get my money, where I make my money from is when my phone rings or I get an email from a company saying, we just lost $1 million a year client. And I think it's because of some weird communication problem, like help.
But that's not how you started, right? That's not
Not at
that's
all.
not how this whole thing started.
I'm my own client. I mean, I came in. So quick background. So as an American, I was in Boston doing working for a very small company that provides lead generation. So what we do is we build sales pipelines for B2B companies. So they would hire us as an outsourced piece of that marketing puzzle. Did that across North America. The company had an office in Europe, so we also were selling in Europe. And over the years, I just got a little bit of a travel bug and said, well, by the way, we're doing this in Asia. We weren't, but I kind of jumped ahead and just said, hey, we're doing this in Asia. And a ton of companies just said, yeah, okay, if you're doing it in Asia, you're in. Like, we'll sign on with you right away because we don't have any contacts over there. This was 2005, 2006. And so I found myself the Asian guy with like zero Asia experience, which was, again, you got to kind of fake it till you make it. And that's exactly what I did. And so I found myself having to rush over to Asia and figure stuff out and build up my own company and help other companies build up their companies. So I was oftentimes learning on other people's dime, which thank you for those companies to put up with all of those shenanigans. But that's how I got started. And I wrote the book for a couple reasons, but I felt like in the last 10, 15 years, I was really in this central part where I had hundreds of Western companies coming through, opening up or expanding. And I was involved in it. I'm not saying I did it all, but I was certainly involved in it and watching and sometimes doing the mistakes myself. And we kept repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And I wanted to tell those stories to start using that as a starting point to say, okay, what have we learned from this, if anything, and where can we go next? What can we do with it?
It's amazing that whole journey from, basically being a company that builds lists and builds leads.
Yeah.
And as a marketer, right, I have used services such as the ones that you've offered, especially even when I was in Japan. We were looking for ways to break into certain marketplaces.
Yeah, Japan is a tough one, yeah.
Yeah, and I know that we talked about a little bit last time that it's like there's Asia and there's Japan, and it's usually referred to as Asia ex Japan, right?
Yeah, most job titles are APJ, so director of APJ, Asia Pacific, Japan, and the thing that I think Americans or people outside of the region don't understand is that here in Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan is as exotic and foreign to someone in Singapore as it is to someone in the United States. Because oftentimes in the U.S., we might bundle everything and just, oh, that's Asia. Like, whoa, Japan is a whole different beast, which is why I love talking to people like you with like specific Japan experience, because
and nothing else.
Exactly.
That's the thing about Japan. Once you start to get the Japan experience, you're kind of in the Japan funnel, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I get that.
I've been around Asia a bit. I relate a little bit of a kind of story of a trip I had to Singapore with Raymond. But, being in Japan for so long and then kind of reading your book, the lessons that come across in your book for taking things slow, for listening, for consensus building, those all 100% apply to basically any marketplace that you're going into, certainly in Asia, but definitely to Japan.
What I found was that, so in my experience, what I was doing was I was hit with not just one market or culture at a time. It was like this flood from like a fire hose of stuff. So, I built and put people in 6 or 7 countries almost overnight. And so from 8 to 8:30, I'm talking to someone in Vietnam. From 8:30 to 9, I've got my Thailand call. And then I'm talking to my Australian client, and then I'm pivoting back to my person in Indonesia. I don't know anything. So what you've got to do is you've got to have some starting point to get your head around all of these different moving parts. You talk to some people who are super experienced or experts in one market, and that's fantastic. And oftentimes they've got the language skills, they've got a deep dive. I love that idea. I have nothing against it, but that doesn't help when all of a sudden you're up against 10 or 15 markets at a time. So it's like it's kind of a different way of thinking about stuff.
You're describing me a little bit. I will say, right? Just Japan, Japanese, right? I didn't go there with the intention of becoming a global professional with a specialty in Japanese. I just wanted to be in Japan, right? But then I ended up there for a long time and doing business with foreign companies in Japan, with Japanese companies here. So it is still my realm of expertise.
You sound like an accidental business nomad. Sorry.
I very well felt, I didn't know what to call myself until I picked up your book, because it's totally true. It's totally true. And I still am, because I'm here in the States, and I'm doing the podcast, I'm doing my own thing, but I do have a day job working for a very big Japanese company. And working for a Japanese company in the U.S. is like working for a Japanese company in Japan in so many ways, except for the fact that, your rank and file staff are not Japanese people, but the management are all Japanese.
Right. So managing up is totally different experience than managing your team.
Well, totally. But you're also having to deal with all of the cultural issues that would come up in working in Japan with, I'm not going to call them seagulls, because our guys are very nice and wonderful, but you do get the occasional seagull.
You've seen it, right? You've seen it happen.
I've seen it happen on both ends. And
Can we
this is where I
define
wanted
seagull for people that don't know what that is?
That's exactly where I'm going right now, Kyle.
There you go.
Like, I wanted to kind of get into this, some of the particulars of the book. Like I said, I'm dealing with multicultural issues every day in my work, and reading the book, I'm like trying to say, okay, oh yeah, well, this person that I know is like the bulldog character, and this person is. I wrote down some of these. You use a lot of animals in your book, right? You've got your seagulls, you've got your fish, you've got your snake, right?
Yeah.
But the seagulls are like the first one that really pops up. Actually, or is it the slapdragons? I think the slapdragons.
Slapdragons and seagulls. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of animal imagery.
Animal or fantasy
around.
animal things.
Yeah.
I definitely wanted to talk a little bit about the slapdragons and seagulls. But why?
Yeah.
Tell us about the seagulls and how that kind of set you on your kind of.
I just love the expression because it was delivered to me by this. I think it was a Singaporean, and God, it's just so direct. And I don't know if I'm allowed to use some vulgarity because I toned it down a little bit, but in the book. But
go for it.
He just kind of said it this aside once. He's all you seagulls are the same, and I kind of at first I just kind of thought I misheard him, and he said it again. But what's a seagull? He goes, you seagulls, you Western managers, like you're these big white animals that come flapping in. You land, you make a ton of noise, you shit all over the place, and then you fly away. I was like, yeah, that's actually a really good. That's exactly what happens.
Or else you hover silently and you steal somebody's fries.
Yeah, right. You come down, and just disrupt everything, but then it's mess, and then you're gone. And I think that the gone part is important too, because headquarters oftentimes, decides to show up only when there's some trouble. They come in and they are like, well, this is how it's done in our part of the world, and you got to do this, and okay, you got it? All right, I'm out of here. And, in the old days, the business trips would be the people flying in. Hey, we're flying in because relationships are so important, and we want to make sure that we're building relationships. And I'm so glad to be here. I'm here for half a day because I'm flying to Hong Kong, and then I'll be in Japan for a day. And relationships are really important. And I've got my luggage sitting right behind me. And in this part of the world, like, that's not relationship building. That's just being a seagull, right? That's just flying in, poking around, making a mess, and then leaving, right? So I was always taken by that phrase. I thought it was great.
It's a great one. I had heard it for the first time 2 weeks ago from our mutual friend Raymond.
Aha, got it.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And but it immediately left my mind. I mean, it's great term. And then I saw it in your book. I said, Raymond probably stole it from you, although maybe he didn't.
I honestly, I've been playing around with that phrase for a long time, so I don't know.
It's so perfect.
Yeah.
And look, when I was working in a previous iteration of my career, I was transferred from Japan to Sydney, right?
Yeah.
So you want to talk about a culture shock situation. I really wish I would have read your book. That was like 11 or 12 years ago. I really wish I would have read your book then.
So it's funny that you said, just to interrupt for 1 second, because that was the starting point. It was like, what do I wish I was handed when I showed up here? That was what I was trying to accomplish.
And if I had it, it probably would have made things a little bit easier.
Right? You still have to go through the experience, but you kind of, hopefully, the stuff kind of buries in the back of your head, and you go, wait a minute. Your
story about Claire and is it Leon, the guy,
I thought it was
sales guy.
So I haven't read my book in a while now. Was it Leonard or?
It's Leonard or Leon, right?
The reason I don't remember is because I've changed them twice just to make sure. Like, I made sure everybody was anonymous.
Well, the thing is, like, Claire is this very direct, Western style, take no prisoners.
Yep.
Communication style.
She's probably my favorite character in the book because there's so many Claires out there, I think.
Yeah, and she evolves, which is really interesting too. Like everybody in the book evolves, which is really cool too. But except for this guy that works for her.
Some evolve, some don't.
Yeah, but he's only in for a little while. He gets hired by her, and he, from her perspective, just does not perform at all. He's he basically just curls into himself, doesn't respond to her needs. He's not making phone calls like he's supposed to be an aggressive sales job, but he's showing not one sign of aggression whatsoever. And in the book, you get into all the reasons why this happens. Really, the fundamental flaws in hiring people for the wrong reasons and around there. In my case, just before I turn, I just want to say that I was that guy because I had been in Japan for so long that I almost went pod and sort of became very passive and consensus oriented, so that when I moved to a direct culture, I did not know how to react. And my management and the people who I was working for did not know how to manage me or work with me. So it was a mismatch.
My aha moment in that situation was finding some of the behavioral profiling models that help put definition to these types of things. So there's pros and cons to behavioral profiling models, but in a cross-cultural setting, I found the tools to be incredibly helpful as a great starting point, just to get my head and just to drive a little bit of clarity into what's going on. I think probably I kind of use the word Claire for the word clarity, just kind of as a little play. But to me, Claire's personality, her behavior type was a dominant, Western, task-focused, business first, just get the job done, very direct, confrontational. And she hired, I think was it Daryl? I want to say it's Daryl, who was the complete opposite. And quiet, consensus-driven, doesn't speak up. And what's interesting about some of this behavioral psychology is that under pressure, people tend to become more of themselves. In other words, if you are naturally dominant, loud, aggressive, task-focused, under pressure, you become more of that. Now, under pressure for someone like Daryl, he becomes more quiet. And if you want to upset or frustrate a dominant person, become more quiet. Don't answer a question.
Tell me about it.
And ah. Don't kind of try and make everybody happy by finding, the middle ground. That's just going to really make someone even more frustrated. What happens to that person? They get more stressed out. They become even more quiet. So what you end up with is this complete opposite forces happening where they're actually repelling one another. And I look at this all the time in team dynamics. And this isn't a cross-cultural thing. This is an individual thing. This happens domestically as well. But this is oftentimes a really common starting point for team breakups and issues happening within teams. In 2020, I don't know about you, but I think there's probably more stress and pressure than normal. These types of things virtually are happening more frequently. So I find the behavioral profiling models to be a really helpful starting point to put some definition to what's going on. Because if you can start measuring this stuff, you can better manage it.
And you talk about that pretty extensively in the book, specifically the DISC profile system.
Yeah, I use that as one starting point. That was what Axel kind of introduced to me. Yeah, I'd played with DISC years before when I was back in the US, and I never really thought much about it. Same with all the behavioral stuff. I kind of looked at it as like astrology.
Yeah.
And I get the argument that there's trouble to it, but man, I just found it a really helpful tool. So that's why I spend so much time on it, because in my world now, what I do, I train companies and I do workshops. I find that stuff as a starting point, as a pillar or a foundation, it helps with future coaching. It helps with understanding team dynamics. It helps with managing people virtually. It helps in selling environments. So I'm a convert. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I had a similar journey. I think I had my first experience with the DISC profile like 15 years ago, and reading your book reminded me of it.
Yeah,
so,
good. Yeah.
So afterwards, I went and I did it again. I decided to do it, and my profile's changed over time, as it does occasionally happen, but not dramatically.
Yeah, the data suggests, and it's interesting. They're actually starting to have like legitimate studies that look at this because, and it's only happening now because it takes. They're looking at people over 40 years, right? So they're testing people in their 20s, and then they're kind of following them throughout their careers, throughout their lives, and they're getting enough data sets to actually have peer-reviewed publications on this. And what they're finding is that your profile changes a little bit generally, but not huge, not in giant amounts, with the exception if there is a massive psychological moment or change that's happened to you.
Oh, yeah,
That
I can
seems to
imagine.
be a very big exception. One could argue, going from New Jersey to Japan,
Yeah.
I would think that would have a pretty profound effect on somebody's behavior. But the argument, though, is that the counter argument is that our core behaviors don't change. Experience gets layered on top of that, but there's a
Yep.
core behavior in all of us. So
Well,
that's kind of the argument.
well, what I found is that the change that I see in the profile is in degree mostly.
Yeah.
And I was a very high like when I first took it, I was very high dominant, right? D.
Yep.
And and I was fighting it. Like D and I were relatively close.
Yep.
Now the D has virtually disappeared, right? I mean, it's gone relatively speaking.
Yep.
And now I'm very high I, which makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
And
Podcast guy. Yeah.
just being out there and trying to exert my influence, but
Yep.
also a little bit disorganized. If I would show you my desk right now, it's like Post-it notes everywhere. But anyway, it's just a fascinating way to kind of mark some of the times in your journey. And I certainly have had different things happen in between the two. It's been 15 or 18 years since I took it. But it is interesting to see how accurate I think it is.
What I find within a team, and it is a really good idea from a team building perspective, and this year is a good time to do it, especially as people are under stress and there's just everybody's scrambling to get stuff done. I've had a lot of teams, a lot of success, just kind of taking a step back and just let's have a little bit of fun with this, right? Let's not take it overly seriously, but it's a pretty good way to get a better read on yourself. Because one of the big things for any leadership training is you've got, if you're going to lead other people, if you're going to influence people, you've got to know who you are first.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a really helpful, especially for guys like me. I'm kind of lazy. Maybe I'm not that thoughtful. So it's helpful just to at least get somebody else to give me an insight or a starting point. Do I agree or disagree with this? It kind of gets the ball rolling for really interesting conversations to happen.
It also gives you this kind of excuse sometimes to have a hard conversation.
Yeah, it's a safe way to have a hard conversation.
Yeah.
It's not me saying that you've been really quiet and avoiding kind of all this stuff. The report suggests this. Here's an example when I saw that pop up. Can we talk about it?
Yeah, when I've taken other of these kind of either personality or performance related profiling tests, they're all relatively similar. So at least I feel like at this stage in my life, I've got a degree of self-awareness that
there you go. That's
a lot of brought on. But it's fantastic, and I think that it's a really good key to people who are trying to work internationally and build these kind of global teams. Which kind of makes me think, like, we touched on it a little bit, but like, what exactly would you say, like, now with the benefit of a decade and a half of experience in this and having really focused on it to the point where you wrote a book and where you do it for a living? What is it that makes a global professional a professional? Like, what is it that really defines the global professional?
So, and again, just it plays right into what we just talked about, but I think that a global professional who is really on the ball with this stuff has a very strong understanding of what makes him or her tick. At the same time, they have an understanding and a willingness to admit that their way isn't necessarily the right way. It's a release of ego. So ego, you almost have to shatter your ego in one way or the other. Oftentimes a good expat assignment will just kind of tear you apart, and when you rebuild yourself, hopefully you do, you come back with a little bit more humility. And I think that when I'm working with people, I'm always looking to see, do they fundamentally think they're right? If they think they're right, we've got a problem. You're probably going to have a harder journey to be effective in different parts of the world. I'm working with this company right now, and I've got a very stubborn guy. He's from Perth, Australia, construction-esque industry, and he's done it for 30 years and always domestically. He is the ultimate D personality type that we've talked about. Dominant, direct, all this stuff, vulgar. And he inherited a team across Southeast Asia. Wasn't his choice, but that's just, they expanded and he was the top dog, and the top dog all of a sudden gets responsibilities. He became an accidental business nomad. And so he cut and pasted his management style to the rest of the region. And it failed immediately. And when you start talking about, well, there's other working styles where people are more indirect. Sometimes they don't want to be directly confrontational. Sometimes they're hesitant to bring issues to their manager. And his response is bullshit. I'm not putting up with any of it. This is my way. It's my way. I've been doing this for 30 years, and guess what? It works. My job is to tell them how to make it work. And that's my example, which is if you think that you're right, you're going to have a very big uphill battle. You've got to almost have that. You've got to let it go. There are other ways to get stuff done. And once you, I think, open up to that, then life becomes a lot more interesting. It's not easy, but it becomes interesting.
It's something that I think anybody who's worked abroad has seen this happen, for extended period of time, for sure. Especially when you have market entry situations where a company's coming in and just like, we're a multi-billion-dollar company. We know how it's done, so we're going to set up the office the way we want to set it up, and
Yeah, no, I deal with a lot of tech companies. So you get a lot of the Silicon Valleys, and look, they've had mega success. We've grown. Look at our stock price. Look at it's 2010 to 2019, like party time. We got it, and it's us. We figured it out. So Southeast Asia, as one example, they're going to love us, and it's just like, okay, but maybe. Let me give you another example. This woman, I met this woman years ago. She runs a consulting business, or she used to, and she did this in an experiential way. I loved what she did. She's ex-Disney, and so she always says that she's got a little bit of mouse blood running through her veins when she thinks about coming up with consulting gigs. But she takes next-gen leaders and from like a big company, and she would bring them. They would do a multi-day workshop in a place like India, in like Delhi. They'd be in a 5-star hotel because that's what you do. And she'd say, right, here's a case study. And it was almost like a business school type of case study. You have to feed 10,000 people 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Here is the supplies. Here's your constraints. Come up with a system as to how you're going to do that. Right? And so she'd have these 30 young MBA grads in this 5-star hotel in Delhi working through this stuff in a boardroom, right? And they've got their spreadsheets, and they've got their PowerPoints, and they've got their org charts, and their Gantt charts and technology. And everybody's got a slightly different variation as to how they're going to create this system. She goes, right, everybody onto the bus. So they all have to leave, and they get onto a bus. And she takes them into what is essentially the ghetto. I don't remember the name of the place, but she takes them into deepest, darkest part of New Delhi, where there is a mosque that feeds 10,000 people 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. And she tells them to go out of the bus. She gives them one translator because nobody there speaks English. She goes, figure out how they actually do it. Absolutely fascinating. And for people who haven't been to Delhi, terrifying, right?
Okay.
This is humanity in its extremes. And it's difficult to figure out anything. And one of the things they learn is that there's actually nobody in charge.
Interesting.
This thing has been working without issue for the most part for decades, feeding 10,000 people a day, 3 meals a day, 10,000 meals, whatever, 30,000 meals a day, 7 days a week. And the point was, there was nothing on any of their spreadsheets or their answers that looked at all like what happens in reality. And they never in a million years would have guessed how it's done. In fact, they still couldn't figure out how it's done. The point is that there are a hell of a lot of ways to get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And I think it's a powerful, example, right? What a cool experience to be able to go through that. Because I think that kind of thing hopefully opens people's minds to future times when you start thinking about problem solving.
Well, it absolutely speaks to the idea that there are connections between connections among things and among people that we just don't see or comprehend.
Yeah.
I think your Taiwanese story kind of told a little bit about that. Your friend Chen is kind of going into that a little bit. I'm sorry, I'm throwing this stuff at you because I literally just read the book the last.
Yeah, no, it's great. I appreciate it. I love it. It's good.
But Chen was extremely wise about these kinds of things, talking about the differences between Socrates and Confucius, and the need to break things down on the Western end, from a Western side of things, whereas the Eastern, we'll just use Western and Eastern for the sake of argument, whereas the Eastern way would be just to go from big to small, right?
Yeah. Right,
so
right.
I thought that was brilliant.
It kind of starts with this mindset of just, interconnectivity of everything, whereas the Western mindset is let's break everything apart and study its small pieces and then try and put it together. Yeah. DISC is a perfect example of a Western mindset. Let's look at behavior types, which are completely interconnected, obviously. But what are we trying to do? We're trying to break them apart. We're trying to put human beings into buckets, right? I mean, we say we don't do that, but that's kind of what's happening.
Totally.
So even if you think about modern behavioral studies, it's a very Western approach to doing it. And again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I that's my background. That's how I still think. But at least I can acknowledge that that's how I think, and that's not how everybody else thinks. One of the ideas that I loved was, I don't think it's in the book, but I think the Chinese came up with or made the connection that tides are connected to the moon. And they came up with that like 500 years before any scientists in the West. So, we're here like celebrating our scientific revolution, which was quite a revolution. But because other parts of the world were thinking about interconnectivity in different ways, they had more of an ability to kind of make connections that you never would have made, right? Yeah. The Western approach to figuring out tides would be to stare at like the beach. Like, how the hell's this happening, right?
Yeah, you measure where the water goes to.
Exactly, right.
Measure the position of the moon.
And I would argue that this is the cool thing about working globally is to be able to take the best of all those worlds. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to tell you that one side's better or worse. There's pros and cons to all this stuff.
Yeah.
Can we keep an open mind and say, well, maybe the answer is let's have this Western kind of step-by-step, small to big approach, but then let's think about this in this bigger way and smaller way, right? Like that's to me is creativity. That's innovation.
Well, it seems that that's part of the big answer here is that you can't be one cultured. You can't be monocultured when you're working globally. And, especially if there's all the when in Rome, et cetera. Right. And I like in the book how you point out it's not do unto others as you would do unto yourself. It's do unto others as they want to be. I'm not saying that right at all, but do unto others as they want to be done too. That's terrible. That's terrible.
No. Okay, so well, it depends on what you're into. So the old golden rule was treat people the way you want to be treated.
Yeah.
But the idea that I was trying to drive home, and this is again not my idea, but this is kind of the big aha for me, which really changed how I think about things, which is treat people the way they want to be treated. And that gets into, that question that you asked about kind of that global mindset and leadership, which is you have to understand that the world doesn't think the way you do.
Right.
If you are Claire, that contact, like being incredibly task focused and direct might be how you want to be treated. It's how I want to be treated. Mm-hmm. But what I found, in many ways, I was Claire. Right. So you know what I mean. Like that, and there are so many people that were there, or that have gone through that, and so the big aha was you've got to. It's up to you to adjust. You can't expect the world to adjust. It's
a shift that you're seeing, I think, not just in the way that we have to deal with other cultures, but fundamentally, like, and just to put on the marketing hat for a second here, right? Everything is about your audience. And, you cannot be a successful marketer now by telling them what you want them to know. Now you have to actually understand what they want to know first.
Yeah.
So you have to really understand what the audience wants, what they need. And if what you're doing does not deliver that, then you're dead in the water.
Yes.
They're in control is the point, right? I think that's the same or a very similar lesson that we're drawing here when you're working cross-culturally is you can't go in there saying, I have the product and I'm going to tell you the way that it needs to be done. You have to really be able to understand what is right for the people that you are working with and working for.
One thing that's happened, one trend, again, we're talking a lot of East-West here, but I think that's the big story of the century. I think that, the big business story was this globalization push, this hyper globalization. And oftentimes it was Western companies rushing into emerging markets across Southeast Asia. That, statistically speaking, that was kind of like the big transfer that's been happening. And 20 years ago, 10 years ago, you could get away with much more, where you just say, like, I'm showing up from the US, I'm showing up from Western Europe, from Australia. We've got our premium product. Boom, you're welcome, emerging market. And that's not the case anymore. These emerging markets have emerged, and they've got local competitors who have a much more profound understanding of local audience preferences, needs, requirements. So if you show up as a seagull or whatever animal we want to use at the moment, that party's over. We can't get away with that stuff anymore.
I mean, it would be amazing to me if there are still slapdragons out there.
They're like what I found was amusing, and I always find just sort of I like the absurdities of everyday life, especially business life. I find it absolutely fascinating and worthy of calling out. But there are companies that slap dragons on products. I mean, it was meant as a metaphor.
It's great.
But what I kept coming across was that it actually happens.
Yeah, and just for the listeners, just to define that just a little bit, Kyle, you want to tell the story real quick of the slap dragon?
So this I had a client out of Texas. Yeah, I had a client out of Texas years ago who had a software product, and he sent me his marketing material to send out to parts of Southeast Asia. And I'm looking at the material, and it's like all baseball imagery, and it's people, and he's using expressions like, oh, well, this is make it a home run and knock it out of the park. And his spelling is all American spelling. Again, nothing wrong with that. It's working in his market. He was killing it. But I kept pointing all this stuff out to him. So like, people here aren't going to relate to this at all. And he pushed back. He was like, everybody knows what baseball is. I think everybody does. But at the same time, is that the message that you want to convey, right? Like, you are very clearly showing that you are from another part of the world, thinking about the world in a totally different way. People are not going to buy that. And he did not like that idea. So what he ended up he got mad at me, and he said, well, just slap a friggin' dragon on it, and we'll make it Asian. And I keep thinking, I mean, I think about it all the time. And the book title was originally going to be called Slapdragons, which I love. Sweet. I love the phrase. Mm-hmm. So at least it got to stay as a chapter title, I think. But so there are these slapdragons out there, and that's not just a west to east thing. So this is happening the other way as well. So you end up with companies that come into other parts of the world, and they're just slapping their approach to new markets. I think I told a mini story of a Malaysian guy who bought a football club in Wales.
In Wales, yeah.
And the team was the Bluebirds. The Bluebirds, and he tried to change it to the Red Dragons.
Yeah.
Because he was trying to build audience back in Malaysia and across, which the idea was interesting because, and he was trying. In Wales, the dragon is very, embedded imagery, and he was using the Welsh dragon. So he thought that was a good fusion blend. But, I try and explain this to like my friends back from Boston. Like, imagine if someone from the other side of the world bought the Red Sox and was like, you know what, you Americans obviously like naming teams after laundry, socks. We think that clothing isn't the most interesting, so we're going to change you to like the red, whatever, like the blue birds, it's a blue, anything.
Yeah.
And people were like, oh, that would never happen. That's insane. It's like, well, that's exactly what happens. And we Westerners have been doing that on the other way. So I think it's kind of a fun way to play with it, just to give people a different perspective.
Well, you get that happens all the time, and I'd be lying if I said I don't see it happen sometimes from Japanese companies that are, exporting their businesses abroad. Particularly
That's
Japanese companies are
and their management styles,
kind of crazy about that.
I'll tell you, like a good movie that came out. I don't know if you've seen it, The Factory.
I haven't seen that yet.
On Netflix. That's a worthwhile one. That's a perfect example. That's a Chinese company that purchased a factory in the Midwest in the United States. And they brought their management team in. And I thought they did a great job in that movie showing both sides. So the Americans are sitting there going like, this is crazy. This management approach is brutal. It's top down. It's hierarchical. It's incredibly regimented. And the Chinese come in and they're looking at these people and they're going, these people are lazy. They are unmotivated. They don't know what they're doing. And I mean, it was a perfect example of misunderstandings on both sides. And I think the movie did a good job of capturing both sides of that. So that's a recommendation for people that are interested in the topic. It's
great that we're recognizing these things a lot more than we ever did before.
Hopefully.
To a degree.
I hope so, yeah.
Well, I mean, I hope we don't recognize them too much. Otherwise, like guys like us will be probably out of jobs, But
yeah. I don't think that's going to be a risk.
That's what I say. But I do really appreciate these differences that we have among cultures, and certainly working abroad was a major. I mean, I am a different person because of my experience in Japan.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever recovered yet. I've been back in the States for 10 years, but just starting to really feel like an American again, I guess. Maybe sometimes, I don't know. My wife's Japanese. Japan is a deep part of me. But one last thing I wanted to just touch on, because it was very interesting to me going through the book, and like the last paragraph of the book, like the penultimate two sentences, sharing stories and building connections are one of the most powerful tools out there. So tell your stories and learn from others. This is a direct quote from your book. This is exactly what my podcast is. Like exactly, word for word.
Isn't it? Yeah, and podcasting in general, but that's great. I mean, this is because I think that, just take it a step backwards for a second, what I find is that when people make mistakes, those are the first things that people kind of don't talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to cross-cultural stuff, there's sensitivity there. You got to be careful that you don't come across sounding. I'm sure there are people who are horrified at some of the ways I approach this. That's not my intent, but that's probably what I get. Fine. Mm-hmm. But telling these stories helps. It helps get a conversation going. It helps make people feel more comfortable. And I think that this podcast is a perfect idea and a perfect vehicle for this type of stuff. So I applaud you for pushing forward on it, because I think it's great.
You actually elucidated it better than I did, and I'll, in your book. But just to bring it full circle, though, back to we started talking about being in a bar and the Bill Bryson-esque nature of the storytelling, and I just thought, when I read that line, sharing stories, building connections. What is the very best place to sit down, tell stories, build connections?
Right.
In the bar. I mean, even if you're not a drinker, it's a great, let's just call it the metaphorical bar, but someplace where you can be free to sit down with your mates and just bullshit with each other and get those stories out, because that's the learning. Yeah. I think, in my experience,
You said it better than I did, so I think that's a good place to leave it. I think you're right.
Well, we're not going to leave it exactly there, because I want you to, I just want people to know that they should look for you and for your book, The Accidental Business Nomad. Look for it on Amazon.com.
Talking about globalization for a second. So the book actually hasn't come out in the rest of the world. So it's only out in North America right now.
Interesting.
It comes out on August 27th, the rest of the world, which has been a little bit of a logistical headache for somebody who's obviously selling to like global teams and like, well, you can get it, but you can't. And,
wow.
A little bit of a headache from that.
Then I feel a little privileged for that. But
you got your hands on it. You got it early. But one cool thing, they're doing the audio book right now. So there's a guy who's doing it. And
well, I'm sure it's going to be wonderful because the source material is great. Anybody wants the book, I highly recommend it. Go to Amazon, pick it up, The Accidental Business Nomad. You can find Kyle on LinkedIn and elsewhere. Look at the title of this episode to see how you spell his name. Right now he's in Singapore. I mean, you're gonna be there for the duration, you think, Kyle? Or?
Well, I'm in lockdown now. I'm not going anywhere.
But as we all are.
No, look, we are probably nomadic. I think we'll be moving on at some point in the next few years. Don't know where. But we'll see. You know, we're all virtual now anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
I would say that people, take a look at the website, which would be leadershipnomad.com, and that'll take you to all the different sources.
Fantastic. It's been a pleasure, Kyle.
Same. Love it.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Dan Nessel Show, please head on over to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or the podcast player of your choice to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. And please don't forget to spread the word. Thanks for listening.